Imagine winning 6 world championships. 6 times standing on the biggest stage in sports. 6 times holding that trophy above your head while 20,000 people scream your name. 6 times being part of something so legendary that 30 years later, people still talk about it like it happened yesterday. Now imagine that after all of that, after every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every bone-crushing defensive play, history still writes your name in second place. Not because you weren't good enough. Not because you didn't earn it. But simply because the person standing next to you was Michael Jordan. This is the story of Scottie Pippen. The man who grew up in a house with 2 wheelchairs, a father who could no longer speak, and a mother who worked herself to exhaustion just to feed 12 children. A boy from Hamburg, Arkansas, a town so small, most maps forgot to include it, who became one of the greatest basketball players who ever lived. And yet, the world almost never saw him coming. He wasn't recruited in high school. He didn't arrive at college as a star. He arrived as the equipment manager, the guy who carried shoes for the actual players. But here's what no one tells you about Scottie Pippen. The silence he lived in as a child? It made him unstoppable. And if you think you know this story, I promise you don't. Not yet. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see greatness forever. Let me ask you something nobody ever asks. What would you do if you were one of the most important players on the most dominant team in NBA history, and you were being paid less than a rookie who had never won a single championship? What would you do if your teammates knew your value, your coaches knew your value, the entire basketball world was beginning to understand your value, but your paycheck said something completely different? What would you do if the dynasty you helped build, the rings you bled for, the sacrifices you made night after night, were always going to be credited to someone else's name? Most people would explode. Most people would demand a trade, demand a press conference, demand the world stop and pay attention. Scottie Pippen did something harder. He kept playing. He kept winning. He kept doing the work nobody wanted to do, guarding the most dangerous player on the other team, making the pass that set up the game-winning shot, running coast to coast while everyone watched the star beside him. He did it because of a promise he made, not to the Chicago Bulls, not to Michael Jordan, but to a family back in Arkansas. A mother who deserved to rest. A father in a wheelchair who deserved to see his son succeed. This is not just a basketball story. This is a story about what it costs to build something great, and how history decides who gets the credit. Let's go back to the beginning, Hamburg, Arkansas. If you've never heard of it, that's exactly the point. This is not a place that produces NBA legends. There are no gleaming basketball courts here, no AAU coaches scouting the next great talent, no local newspaper running headlines about rising stars. There are red dirt roads, cotton fields, and old wooden homes that have seen better days. And inside one of those homes, a house too small for 12 children, Scottie Pippen began his life. Think about that number for a moment. 12 siblings under one small roof. 12 voices, 12 hungry mouths, 12 bodies competing for space in rooms that were never meant to hold that many people. Poverty wasn't just present in that house, it was the wallpaper, the floorboards, the air itself. But Scottie's childhood wasn't just hard because of money. It was hard because of what illness did to the men in his family. His father, Preston Pippen, was once a strong man. A working man. The kind of man who holds a family together through sheer force of will and consistency. Then one day, without warning, a stroke hit. Sudden. Merciless. Permanent. When it passed, Preston Pippen could no longer walk. Could no longer speak clearly. Could no longer work. The man who had been the family's anchor was now confined to a wheelchair, present in body, but robbed of everything that had defined his strength. And then, as if that weren't enough, another blow. One of Scottie's brothers was also paralyzed after a devastating accident. 2 wheelchairs. 1 small house. 1 mother trying to hold everything together. For a young boy, those images become the architecture of your mind. You don't just see the wheelchairs and move on. You carry them. You see your father by the window in the afternoon light, unable to stand, and something permanently changes inside you. You watch your mother leave before sunrise and return after dark, exhausted but never complaining, and you understand, even without words, that life can be unmerciful. But here is the thing about Scottie Pippen that the world never fully understood. That pain didn't break him. It built him. Quietly. Slowly. Without anyone noticing. No major high school programs came calling for Scottie Pippen. No recruiters drove through Hamburg. No scholarships arrived in the mail. When his senior year ended, while other players were making decisions between prestigious universities with full rides and promises of professional futures, Scottie had one option: the University of Central Arkansas. And even there, he didn't arrive as a player. He arrived as the equipment manager. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who would go on to be named one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history, one of the most complete defenders the game has ever seen, started his college career carrying shoes for other people and collecting balls after practice ended. He stood on the sidelines. He watched. He learned by observation. And when the gym was empty and the lights were about to go out, he picked up a ball and worked, alone, unnoticed, unscheduled, because the habit of effort was the only thing he had brought with him from Hamburg. Then something happened that no one predicted. His body changed. Over the course of his first year, Scottie Pippen grew. Not a little, dramatically. He shot up past 6 feet, kept going, and eventually settled at 6 feet 7 inches. But it wasn't just the height. His frame became fluid. His footwork became instinctive. He had a wingspan and a quickness that coaches suddenly couldn't ignore. The equipment manager started getting minutes on the court. And every time he got those minutes, he made the most of them. Not with flashy scoring. Not with highlight dunks. But with something rarer and more valuable, basketball intelligence. He read the game like someone who had spent years studying it from the sidelines. Because he had. By the time the 1987 NBA draft arrived, the skinny kid from Hamburg had turned himself into a prospect. Nobody saw it coming. Not even him. Draft night 1987. Scottie Pippen sat and waited for his name to be called, knowing he had a chance, knowing he wasn't the most talked about name in the room, knowing that for players who come from small colleges and small towns, these moments are more fragile than they look. Then it happened. First round. His name was called. The Seattle Supersonics had selected Scottie Pippen. For a boy whose father sat in a wheelchair back in Arkansas, whose mother had worked herself down to the bone for 12 children, this was a moment that didn't need words. The promise he had made to himself in that quiet house, in those long afternoons, in those empty gyms, it had just become real. But the night wasn't over. Hours later, in a transaction that received almost no media attention at the time, Scottie Pippen was traded to the Chicago Bulls. No fanfare. No lengthy analysis. Just a business decision between two NBA front offices that barely made the back pages of the sports section. But sometimes the smallest moments contain the biggest turning points in history. Because in Chicago, there was already a player the entire basketball world was watching. A young guard who could defy gravity, who could score from anywhere, who made entire arenas hold their collective breath. His name was Michael Jordan. And the dynasty that would define a decade had just quietly found its missing piece. When you play alongside a phenomenon, you have two choices. You can fight for the spotlight and spend your energy resenting where it isn't pointing. Or you can become the reason the spotlight keeps shining on someone else, and find your meaning in the winning, not the recognition. Scottie Pippen chose the second path. Not because he lacked ambition. Not because he was told to. But because he understood, from his very first days in Chicago, what his role needed to be, and he had the character to embrace it fully. While Michael Jordan was the fire, the unstoppable scoring machine, the face on every billboard, the name every child in America was writing on their sneakers, Scottie Pippen became the structure that kept that fire burning. He guarded the opposing team's most dangerous player. Every night. Without complaint. While Jordan rested his energy for offense, Pippen was chasing the fastest guards in the league from one end of the court to the other. He passed. He set screens. He created open shots for teammates, deflected passes in the passing lanes, made defensive rotations that prevented points nobody ever counted up afterward. Inside the Bulls' locker room, the players knew. Coaches knew. Phil Jackson, one of the greatest minds in basketball history, later said something that history doesn't repeat often enough, that without Scottie Pippen, there is no dynasty. Not one championship. Not two. Not six. But outside the locker room? The world saw what the cameras showed. And the cameras always followed Michael Jordan. Scottie Pippen understood this. He had grown up in a house where silence was a form of strength. Where you did what needed to be done, not for applause, but because the family needed it. The Chicago Bulls were his family now. And his family needed him to be exactly what he was. Steady. Sacrificial. Indispensable. And invisible to everyone except those who truly understood the game. In October 1993, Michael Jordan shocked the entire sports world. He was leaving. Walking away from basketball at the peak of his powers. Every analyst, every commentator, every fan asked the same question immediately: what happens to the Chicago Bulls now? The assumption was obvious. Without Jordan, the Bulls would collapse. The dynasty was over. The team would fall back into mediocrity. Chicago without Jordan was a car without an engine. Nobody was asking what Scottie Pippen could do. And then the 1993-94 season happened. Pippen exploded. He became the team's leading scorer. He became the primary ball handler, the defensive anchor, the emotional leader, the strategic center of everything the Bulls did on both ends of the floor. He finished near the top of MVP voting. The Bulls, the team everyone had written off, made the playoffs. For the first time in his career, the entire spotlight was on Scottie Pippen. And he was brilliant. It was the season the basketball world had to reckon with the truth it had been conveniently avoiding. The Chicago Bulls dynasty was not built on one man. It was built on a partnership. On a system. On a player who had spent years doing thankless work in the shadow of greatness, and who, when given the chance to stand alone, proved he had been a superstar all along. Before all the championships came, before anyone knew how dominant the Bulls would become, Scottie Pippen made a decision that came from the most human place imaginable. He signed a long-term contract, 7 years, $18 million, and he did it because of his family in Arkansas. He had watched his father become helpless overnight. He had watched his mother exhaust every ounce of energy she had. He had grown up in a house where the fear of financial instability was as constant as the Arkansas heat. When the Bulls offered him security, he took it. Not greed. Not naivety. Just a son trying to make sure his family would never suffer again. But the NBA grew. Revenues exploded. New players coming into the league began signing contracts that made Pippen's deal look like a misprint. One of the greatest all-round players in the world, a 6-time champion, a perennial all-star, one of the most important players on the most successful team in basketball, was being paid less than players who had achieved a fraction of what he had. That reality quietly burned inside him for years. He never stopped playing hard. He never stopped competing. But in the quiet moments, after games, in the locker room, reading the annual salary lists, Scottie Pippen carried a weight that had nothing to do with basketball. He had chosen his family over his paycheck. And he paid for that choice for years. The 1997-98 season felt different. Everyone in the Bulls organization knew, even if nobody said it out loud, that this was the end. The final run. The last time this group of men would stand together on the court and try to do the impossible one more time. They called it the last dance. And it was exactly that. The Bulls won their 6th championship. The confetti fell. Jordan cried. The arena roared. And one more time, the cameras followed the same face they had always followed. But in the locker room, in the quiet space where teammates speak without words, everyone knew what Scottie Pippen had meant to all of it. Then the lineup dissolved. Phil Jackson left. Jordan retired again. And Scottie Pippen walked out of Chicago, not with a grand farewell, not with a parade in his honor, but with 6 rings, a Hall of Fame resume, and the knowledge that history might take a long time to fully understand what he had given. Sometimes the most important people in any story are not the ones the story is told about. In 2021, Scottie Pippen lost his son Antron. His eldest. The boy who had grown up watching his father become a legend. The young man who had dreamed of following him onto the basketball court, but whose life had been complicated by severe asthma from childhood, a condition that made playing at a high level nearly impossible. Antron never stopped trying. That was what his father said. He fought every single day against something most people couldn't see or understand. When Antron died, something in Scottie Pippen's world became permanently quieter. Championship rings don't help with that kind of pain. Fame doesn't reach into the place a father's grief lives. No amount of Hall of Fame recognition, no documentary, no historical reappraisal changes what it means to lose a child. Scottie Pippen posted a brief message. He called his son beautiful. He called him kind. He said he had fought bravely his entire life. They were not the words of an NBA legend. They were the words of a father. And in that moment, more than any game or any trophy, you understood what Scottie Pippen had always been about. Family. Always, only, forever. Family. 60 years old, Scottie Pippen has stopped trying to explain himself to the world. He doesn't need to. Because history, slowly, honestly, finally, is doing it for him. When people go back and watch those Bulls games today, they don't just see Jordan scoring explosions. They see a 6'7" player gliding across the court, reading the game 3 steps ahead of everyone else, shutting down the most dangerous players in the league, and making decisions that look simple only because he made them look simple. They see Scottie Pippen. In 2010, he was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. In 1992, he stood alongside Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird on the greatest basketball team ever assembled, the United States Olympic Dream Team in Barcelona. He was named one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history. But none of that is the real legacy. The real legacy is this. A boy from Hamburg, Arkansas, with 2 wheelchairs in his living room, a mother who worked until her hands ached, and 0 scholarships, 0 scouts, 0 guarantees, decided that effort was the only currency he had. He showed up. He kept showing up. He did the work that nobody celebrated, and he did it every single night for over a decade. He didn't become a legend by demanding the spotlight. He became a legend by making sure the team kept winning, even when the world forgot to say his name. That is Scottie Pippen. That is what real greatness looks like when it isn't performing for the camera. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching a man be overlooked, undervalued, and underestimated for so long, and still rise to become part of history, then you already understand why Scottie Pippen matters. Not just to basketball, but to anyone who has ever done the hard work without getting the credit. Hit subscribe. Because the next story we're telling is just as powerful, just as overlooked, and just as real. See you there.